Jake Miller had been flying cargo ships for almost 8 years now, and he thought he had seen everything that could happen in space. He was wrong about that. His ship was called the Frontier Dream, and it was not a fancy vessel by any means. It was old and the paint was chipping in several places, but it flew well enough, and that was all Jake needed. He made his living hauling supplies between the outer colonies and mining stations that dotted the edge of human-controlled space. The job was lonely most of the time, but Jake preferred it that way. He had tried working with crews before, but he always ended up frustrated with other people. Flying alone meant he could listen to his music as loud as he wanted and eat his meals whenever he felt like it. The pay was decent enough, and he got to see parts of space that most people back on Earth would never even dream about. Today he was docked at mining station Epsilon 7, which was basically a metal platform attached to a large asteroid. The station existed for one reason only, and that was to extract rare minerals from the rock beneath it. About 200 people lived and worked there, and they all had that tired look that came from spending too much time under artificial lights. Jake had delivered medical supplies and food packages, and now his ship was undergoing a standard maintenance check that would take about 6 hours. He decided to use the time to reorganize his cargo hold because things had gotten messy over the last few runs. Jake grabbed a handheld scanner and headed into the back section of his ship. The cargo area was large enough to hold several shipping containers, and there were storage spaces built into the walls. He had been hearing strange noises for the past day or so, and he figured that some of the cargo had shifted during the last jump through hyperspace. Jake was moving a crate of spare parts when he heard it again. A soft sound that was almost like breathing. He froze and listened carefully. There it was again. Someone or something was in his cargo hold. His first thought was rats, because even in space those creatures somehow found ways to survive. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, and it came from behind a stack of supply containers near the back wall. He approached slowly and called out to ask if anyone was there. No response came back, but he heard movement now. Something was definitely hiding back there. Jake considered calling station security, but something made him hesitate. If it was a person, they might be in trouble, and station security on these outer posts was not known for being gentle. He moved the containers aside one by one until he could see into the dark corner. What he found made him stop breathing for a moment. A girl was huddled against the wall, and she looked terrified. But she was not human. Her skin had a strange quality to it that made it seem to glow faintly with a blue and silver light. Her eyes were much larger than human eyes, and they were completely black with no visible white parts. She was thin in a way that suggested she had not eaten properly in a long time. Her clothes were torn and dirty, but he could tell they had once been nice. The girl stared at him with pure fear in those dark eyes. She pressed herself harder against the wall as if she was trying to disappear into it. Jake raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. He spoke in a calm voice and told her he would not hurt her. She did not respond, but she watched his every movement like a scared animal. Jake backed away slowly and left the cargo hold. His mind was racing with questions. Who was she? And how had she gotten onto his ship, and why was she hiding? The smart thing to do would be to report this to the authorities. Stowing away on transport ships was illegal, and harboring an undocumented alien could get his license revoked. But that girl looked so scared and so hungry that he could not bring himself to turn her in just yet. He went to his personal locker and grabbed a protein bar and a bottle of water. These outer station security teams had a reputation for being rough with illegal aliens. He had heard stories about people being locked up in tiny cells for weeks while paperwork got processed. Some aliens were just sent back to wherever they came from without any investigation into why they were running in the first place. Jake returned to the cargo hold and approached the corner slowly. The girl was still there in the same position. He held up the protein bar and the water bottle so she could see them. He spoke softly and told her he had brought food. She looked at the items in his hands and then back at his face. Her expression was confused, as if she could not understand why he would offer her anything. He set the food and water on the floor about 6 feet away from her, and then backed up to give her space. For a long moment, nothing happened. The girl just stared at the protein bar like it might be a trap. Then slowly and carefully she reached out and snatched it. She tore open the wrapper with trembling hands and ate the entire bar in less than 30 seconds. She grabbed the water bottle next and drank half of it in one go. Jake watched her and felt a deep sadness. Whatever her story was, it had been bad enough to leave her like this. He told her he would bring more food soon, and she looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. He left her alone and went back to the main cabin of his ship. Over the next few hours, Jake returned to the cargo hold 3 more times. Each time he brought food and water, and each time the girl seemed a little less afraid. On his 4th visit, he brought a thermal blanket because the cargo hold could get cold. She accepted it without trying to run away, which he took as progress. His departure window was coming up soon. The maintenance crew had finished their work and he was cleared to leave the station. Jake stood in the main cabin and thought about what he should do. He could still report the girl to station security. That would be the safe choice and the legal choice. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her face and how scared she had been. He thought about her grabbing that protein bar like it was the first food she had seen in days. Jake made his decision. He sealed off the cargo section and made it as comfortable as possible with spare bedding and supplies. He programmed the navigation computer for New Haven, which was his next scheduled stop. The colony there was larger and more developed. Maybe he could figure out what to do with his stowaway once they arrived. As the Frontier Dream pulled away from the station and jumped into hyperspace, Jake wondered what he had just gotten himself into. He had broken about a dozen regulations in the last few hours, and there was an alien girl hiding in his cargo hold. But somehow it felt like the right thing to do. His mother had always told him to help people when they needed it, and this girl clearly needed help. The journey to New Haven would take 6 days through hyperspace, and Jake spent the first few hours wondering how to approach his unexpected passenger. He could not just keep leaving food at her feet like she was some kind of animal. They needed to communicate somehow and figure out what her situation actually was. He checked the cargo hold camera feed and saw that she had wrapped herself in the thermal blanket and was sleeping in the corner he had made comfortable for her. Jake decided to let her rest for now. She clearly needed it. He went about his normal routine of checking ship systems and making sure everything was running smoothly. The Frontier Dream hummed along through hyperspace, and for a while it felt like any other supply run. But every time he glanced at the cargo hold monitor, he was reminded that this trip was very different. Several hours later, he saw movement on the screen. The girl was awake and looking around the cargo hold with curious eyes. Jake gathered some food and water and headed back to see her. When he entered, she tensed up, but she did not try to hide this time. That was progress. He set the supplies down closer to her than before and sat down on a cargo crate about 10 feet away. He started talking to her in a calm voice. He told her his name was Jake and that she was safe on his ship. He said he wanted to help her, but he needed to understand who she was and where she came from. The girl listened but did not respond. She just watched him with those large, dark eyes. After a few minutes, Jake left her alone again, but he felt like maybe she was starting to trust him a little bit. This became their pattern over the next 2 days. Jake would bring food and water and sit nearby while talking to her. He told her about Earth and about his job flying cargo ships. He talked about the colonies and the different alien species that humans had met. Sometimes he would point at objects and say their names in English. The girl started paying close attention when he did this. On the 3rd day, something changed. Jake brought breakfast to the cargo hold and sat down in his usual spot. He pointed at the protein bar and said the word slowly. The girl looked at the bar and then back at him. Her mouth moved and a sound came out that was almost like the word he had said, but with a musical quality that human vocal cords could not quite make. Jake smiled and nodded encouragingly. She tried again, and this time it was closer to the English pronunciation. They spent the next hour like this, with Jake pointing at things and naming them. The girl was incredibly quick at picking up the words. She learned cup and water and blanket and floor and wall. When Jake pointed at himself and said his name, she repeated it almost perfectly. Then she pointed at herself and said something that sounded like music. Jake tried to repeat it, but his attempt was clumsy. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and tried to teach him the right way to say it. After several attempts, Jake gave up and asked if he could call her Lyra instead, because that was the closest English sound to her name. She seemed to understand and nodded. By the 4th day, Lyra was speaking simple English sentences. Her progress was remarkable, and Jake wondered if her species was naturally gifted with languages or if she was just exceptionally smart. She told him that she had been learning human languages from computer files she had accessed on various stations. She had been trying to reach someone who would listen to her, but she had no identification and no way to prove who she was. Jake asked her where she came from. Lyra's expression turned sad and she struggled to find the English words to explain. She told him her people were called the Velkari, and that her home world was very far away. She described floating cities and towers made of crystal that caught the light of their sun. She spoke about her family with a mixture of love and pain that Jake could feel even through the language barrier. He moved their conversations to the unused crew quarters because it seemed wrong to keep talking to her while she sat on the cargo hold floor. The Frontier Dream had been designed for a crew of 4, but Jake ran it alone with automated systems. There were 3 empty crew cabins, and he set one up for Lyra with a proper bed and a small desk. When he showed it to her, she looked around the tiny room like it was a palace. She touched the bed carefully as if she could not believe it was real. Lyra settled into a routine on the ship. She spent hours watching human movies and shows on the computer screen, trying to improve her English. She asked Jake endless questions about Earth and human culture. She wanted to know why humans made music and why they told stories and why they kept pets. Some of her questions were hard to answer because Jake had never really thought about these things before. On the 5th day, Jake was in the cockpit checking their navigation when Lyra came in and sat in the co-pilot chair. She had been getting braver about moving around the ship. She looked out at the swirling colors of hyperspace and asked Jake why he had helped her. He thought about the question for a while before answering. He told her that where he came from, you did not leave kids starving and scared. You helped them when they needed it because that was the right thing to do. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if all humans were like this. Jake laughed and said no, because humans could be just as selfish and cruel as anyone else. But most people tried to do good when they could. Most people wanted to help rather than hurt. He asked if her people were different, and Lyra's expression changed. The sadness came back into her eyes, and she looked away from him. She said something in her own language that sounded beautiful and terrible at the same time. Then she switched back to English and told Jake that if her people knew a human had shown her kindness, everything they believed would be proven wrong. Jake asked what she meant by that, but Lyra shook her head. She said she was not ready to talk about it yet. She needed to find the right words, and she needed to be sure she could trust him completely. Jake did not push her. He figured she would tell him when she was ready. They sat together in the cockpit and watched hyperspace flow past the windows. Lyra seemed more relaxed than she had been since he found her. She even smiled a little when Jake played some music through the ship speakers. He had chosen something soft and calm, and she listened with her eyes closed. That night, Jake lay in his bunk and thought about the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a simple cargo pilot with a boring routine. Now he had an alien girl living on his ship, and he was probably breaking a dozen laws by not reporting her. But when he thought about turning her over to the authorities, something in his gut told him that would be wrong. Lyra was running from something, and she was terrified. Whatever her story was, Jake had a feeling it was important. The next day, they would arrive at New Haven. Jake had already decided he would not report Lyra to anyone until he understood what was happening. He had some friends on the colony who might be able to help, but for now she was safe on his ship, and that was enough. The Frontier Dream dropped out of hyperspace near New Haven, and Jake felt his stomach tighten with worry. He had spent the last 6 days with Lyra, and now he had to figure out what to do next. He could not keep her hidden on his ship forever, and she needed proper help. New Haven was one of the larger human colonies with about 50,000 people living there. The colony had grown around a natural harbor on the planet's main continent, and it served as a trading hub for the outer systems. Jake contacted the docking authority and received clearance to land at the civilian port. He had been to New Haven dozens of times before, and he knew the layout pretty well. The civilian quarter was less regulated than the military section, and people tended to mind their own business there. He had some money saved up, and he could rent a small apartment for a few weeks while he figured things out. He explained his plan to Lyra, and she listened carefully. She was nervous about leaving the ship, but she understood they could not stay there. Jake gave her a hooded jacket to wear and told her to keep her head down. Her skin still had that faint glow to it, but in dim lighting she might pass as human if no one looked too closely. They waited until evening when the port would be busier, and then they left the ship together. The walk through the port district made Jake nervous, but nobody paid them any attention. Everyone was too busy with their own business. He led Lyra through narrow streets to a section of town where temporary housing was available. He found a building that advertised weekly rentals and paid cash for a small apartment on the 3rd floor. The landlord barely looked at them and did not ask any questions. The apartment was tiny with just one bedroom, a bathroom, and a small kitchen area. But it had a lock on the door and windows that looked out over the street. Lyra walked around the space, touching everything like she had done on the ship. She seemed amazed by simple things like the water faucet and the electric lights. Jake realized she must have been living rough for a long time before he found her. He went out and bought food and basic supplies while Lyra stayed hidden in the apartment. When he returned, she was sitting by the window watching the people walk by on the street below. She turned to him and said thank you in English that was getting better every day. Jake told her she did not need to thank him. He was just doing what anyone decent would do. Over the next few days, Lyra's health improved dramatically. With regular food and a safe place to sleep, the constant fear started to leave her eyes. Her skin became brighter and the glow was more noticeable. She smiled more often and asked questions about everything she saw. Jake bought her a data pad and she spent hours reading about human history and one evening, Jake was preparing dinner when Lyra came out of the bedroom and turned on the small television screen in the main room. She was flipping through channels trying to find something interesting to watch. Jake was not paying much attention until he heard her make a sharp gasping sound. He turned to see what was wrong. On the screen was a news report about a diplomatic meeting between human ambassadors and an alien delegation. The aliens on the screen were tall and elegant with that same luminescent skin that Lyra had. They were Velkari. The reporter was talking about cultural exchange programs and trade agreements. The Velkari representatives were smiling and speaking in calm, measured voices about peace and friendship between their peoples. Lyra stood frozen in front of the screen. Her hands were shaking and her breathing had become quick and shallow. Jake moved to her side and asked if she was all right. She did not answer. She just stared at the Velkari on the screen with an expression of pure horror. Jake grabbed the remote and turned off the television, but Lyra continued staring at the blank screen. He guided her to the couch and made her sit down. He got her a glass of water, but she did not drink it. For several minutes, she just sat there trembling. Then finally, she looked up at Jake and the words started pouring out of her. She spoke quickly, mixing English with her own language when she could not find the right words fast enough. Jake had to ask her to slow down several times so he could understand. Lyra told him the truth about her people. The Velkari were not the peaceful civilization they pretended to be. They were conquerors who had destroyed dozens of species across their region of space, but they did not fight wars the way most species did. They had developed a different method that was much more effective and much more terrible. The Velkari were experts in biological warfare. They had scientists who could create diseases tailored specifically to target any species they wanted. When they found a new civilization, they would approach with offers of friendship. They would establish diplomatic relations and cultural exchanges, just like they were doing with humanity right now. They would study the new species, learning everything about their biology and their genetics. Then when the time was right, the Velkari would release a pathogen. It would be designed to spread quickly and kill efficiently. The disease would devastate the target population within weeks. Billions would die in agony while the Velkari watched and waited. And then when the survivors were desperate and broken, the Velkari would arrive with a cure. The cure always came with a price. Total surrender. The surviving members of the species would become part of the Velkari Empire, but not as equals. They would be a permanent underclass serving their conquerors forever. Species after species had fallen this way. The Velkari had built their entire civilization on the corpses of others. Jake listened to all of this and felt sick. He asked Lyra how she knew all of this. She explained that she was the daughter of a high-ranking Velkari official. Her father was part of the leadership council that made decisions about which species to target next. She had grown up in a world of privilege, never questioning what her people did. But one day when she was exploring her family's home computer system, she found files she was not supposed to see. Detailed records of past conquests, scientific reports about pathogen development, plans for future targets. She read through everything with growing horror. When she confronted her parents about what she had found, they did not deny it. They explained calmly that this was how the Velkari survived. They were too few in number to fight conventional wars, so they had to be clever. Lyra's mother had told her she would understand when she was older. Her father said it was the natural order of things. The strong survived and the weak perished. The Velkari were strong because they were smart. They had perfected a system that worked and there was no reason to feel guilty about it, but Lyra could not accept that explanation. She thought about all the billions of beings who had died screaming in pain. She thought about entire civilizations wiped out so the Velkari could expand their territory. She could not live with that knowledge. She could not be part of a species that did such things, so she ran. She stole access codes and identification documents and escaped on a transport ship, leaving Velkari space. She had been moving from station to station for months trying to reach human territory. She wanted to warn Earth about what was coming. She wanted to stop her people from doing to humanity what they had done to so many others. But by the time she reached human space, the diplomatic mission had already begun. The Velkari delegation had been on Earth for months. The cultural exchange was already underway. Lyra had tried to contact authorities, but she had no credentials and no way to prove who she was. A teenage alien girl with a wild story about biological warfare was not taken seriously. Doors were closed in her face over and over. She had been hiding and running and slowly starving when Jake found her in his cargo hold. She looked at him now with tears running down her face. She said the humans on that news report had no idea they were already being studied. The Velkari scientists were probably collecting biological samples right now. They were learning everything they needed to know to create the perfect human killing plague. Jake sat back and tried to process everything Lyra had told him. If she was telling the truth and he believed she was, then humanity was walking straight into a trap. He asked her how much time they had. Lyra said it varied, but usually the Velkari waited at least a year after first contact. They needed time to do thorough research and they wanted to build trust first. The deeper the friendship appeared, the more devastating the betrayal would be. Jake spent the entire night thinking about what Lyra had told him. He barely slept, and when morning came, he knew he had to try to warn someone about the Velkari. He started with the obvious choice and sent messages to Earth Command through official channels. He explained that he had information about a potential threat from the Velkari delegation. He requested an urgent meeting with anyone who would listen. The response came back within a few hours. His message had been reviewed and dismissed. A cargo pilot with no credentials claiming to have inside information about alien intentions was not considered credible. The reply suggested he stop wasting official resources with unfounded conspiracy theories. Jake tried 2 more times through different channels and got similar responses. Nobody was taking him seriously. Lyra watched him grow more frustrated with each rejection. She told him she had experienced the same thing when she first arrived in human space. People did not want to believe that a friendly alien delegation could be planning something so horrible. It was easier to dismiss the warnings than to accept such an uncomfortable truth. Jake thought about his options. He needed someone who would at least listen before deciding he was crazy. Then he remembered Danny Price. They had served together in the colonial military years ago before Jake became a cargo pilot. Danny had saved Jake's life during a pirate raid on a supply convoy, and Jake had returned the favor 6 months later. They had stayed in touch over the years, and last Jake heard Danny was working in colonial intelligence on New Haven. He sent a private message to Danny's personal account asking to meet up for drinks. Danny replied within the hour saying he had time that evening. Jake told Lyra to stay in the apartment and keep the door locked. He promised he would be back as soon as possible. The bar where they met was in the civilian quarter, and it was the kind of place where people went to avoid attention. Danny was already there when Jake arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a beer in front of him. He looked older than Jake remembered, with gray starting to show in his hair. They shook hands and spent a few minutes catching up on old times. Then Jake told him he needed help with something. Serious? Danny's expression changed when Jake started explaining about Lyra. He listened without interrupting, while Jake described finding her on his ship and everything she had revealed about the Velkari. When Jake finished, Danny sat back and was quiet for a long moment. He asked if Jake realized how this story sounded. Jake said yes, but that did not make it less true. Danny admitted he was skeptical, but he was willing to meet Lyra and hear her story directly. He owed Jake that much at least. They left the bar together and walked back to the apartment. Lyra was nervous when Jake brought Danny inside, but she agreed to talk. She spent the next hour explaining everything to Danny in careful detail. She described the Velkari social structure and their military capabilities. She explained how their biological warfare program worked and drew diagrams showing the typical timeline of a conquest. She named specific species that had fallen to Velkari plagues, and described their current status within the Empire. Her knowledge was extensive and specific in ways that would be hard to fake. Danny asked her technical questions about Velkari biology and culture. He wanted to know about their homeworld and their government and their technology. Lyra answered every question without hesitation. She showed no signs of lying or making things up as she went along. Danny took notes on his datapad, and his expression grew more serious as the conversation continued. Finally, Danny asked the question that Jake had been expecting. He wanted to know if there was any way to verify what Lyra was saying. She thought about this for a moment and then nodded. She explained that all Velkari carried biological markers that identified them as immune to their own weapons. Every Velkari child was vaccinated against dozens of different pathogens starting from birth. If human doctors examined her blood, they would find evidence of these vaccines. More importantly, they would find immunity to diseases that did not naturally exist anywhere in Velkari space. These were the engineered plagues that had been used against other species. The vaccines against them would make no sense unless the Velkari had created those diseases as weapons. Lyra said she was willing to undergo any medical testing that Danny wanted. She had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Danny looked at Jake and then back at Lyra. He said he would arrange for a medical examination, but it had to be done quietly. If word got out that he was investigating the Velkari delegation, based on the claims of a runaway girl, his career would be over. Jake and Lyra both agreed to keep everything confidential. Danny made some calls, and 2 days later, Lyra was brought to a private medical facility on the edge of the city. The doctor who examined her was someone Danny trusted completely. Her name was Lisa Grant, and she had worked with Colonial Intelligence before as a consultant. She drew blood samples from Lyra and ran them through every test available. She scanned Lyra's body and took tissue samples. The examination took several hours, and Lyra endured it all without complaint. Jake waited in the lobby with Danny while the tests were being processed. Danny admitted that part of him hoped this would all turn out to be a misunderstanding. The alternative was too terrible to think about. Jake understood the feeling, but he had seen the fear in Lyra's eyes when she talked about her people. That fear was real, and it came from knowing what the Velkari were capable of. Dr. Grant called them into her office 3 days later. She looked shaken as she pulled up the test results on her computer screen. She told them that Lyra's blood work was unlike anything she had ever seen. The girl had antibodies against at least 30 different pathogens. Some of these diseases were known to human science, but most were completely unknown. The variety and specificity of the immunities suggested a highly sophisticated vaccination program. More disturbing was what Dr. Grant had found when she analyzed the antibodies themselves. Several of them were against diseases that could only affect species with biochemistry, similar to races humanity had encountered. There were antibodies against diseases that would target insectoid species and reptilian species, and even one that appeared designed to attack silicon-based life forms. None of these diseases existed naturally, and there was no reason for the Velkari to have immunity to them unless they had created them. Dr. Grant said the evidence was clear. Lyra had been systematically vaccinated against biological weapons. Her immune system had been trained to fight diseases that were engineered rather than evolved. The pattern was undeniable, and the implications were horrifying. Danny asked if she was absolutely certain about this. Dr. Grant said she had run the test 3 times to be sure. There was no doubt. Danny took copies of all the test results and thanked Dr. Grant for her discretion. He drove Jake and Lyra back to the apartment in silence. Once they were inside, he told them he would have to report this up the chain of command. The evidence was too significant to ignore. He could not promise what would happen next, but at least now they had proof that Lyra was telling the truth. Over the next 2 days, Danny worked behind the scenes to get the information to the right people. He bypassed several levels of bureaucracy and sent the medical evidence directly to a friend who worked in the intelligence division on Earth. He included his own report and a detailed statement from Lyra about Velkari methods and history. The response came faster than anyone expected. A team of scientists and military intelligence officers arrived on New Haven within 48 hours. They wanted to interview Lyra immediately. Jake insisted on being present during the interviews to make sure she was treated fairly. The officials agreed reluctantly because they needed Lyra's cooperation. Lyra spent the next week working with the Earth intelligence team. She told them everything she knew about Velkari biological weapons programs. She described the typical deployment methods and the timeline of past conquests. She explained that the Valkyrie always delivered the pathogen through a ceremonial gift. It was usually a work of art or cultural artifact that was given during a formal celebration of friendship. The item would be designed to slowly release the pathogen into the air once it was placed in a populated area. The scientists asked her if she knew when the Valkyrie planned to deploy their weapon against humanity. Lyra said she did not know the exact timeline, but based on standard procedures, it would probably happen within the next few months. The delegation had been on Earth for 3 months already, which meant they had likely completed their biological research. The weapon was probably already being manufactured. One of the intelligence officers asked if there was any way to detect the pathogen before it was released. Lyra explained that Valkyrie bioweapons were designed to be invisible until activated. They used sophisticated camouflage techniques to hide the delivery mechanism. The only way to stop it was to search the Valkyrie delegation's quarters and confiscate any gifts they planned to present. Earth Command moved quickly once they understood the threat. The intelligence team sent all of Lyra's information and the medical evidence back to Earth through secure channels. Within 24 hours, the highest levels of human government were involved. An emergency security council was convened and they reviewed everything Lyra had provided. The evidence was convincing enough that they decided to act immediately. The Valkyrie delegation was placed under quarantine using the excuse of a potential contamination issue at their residence. The Valkyrie representatives protested loudly, claiming this was a violation of diplomatic protocol. But human security forces were polite and firm. The quarantine would remain in place until the contamination could be investigated thoroughly. The Valkyrie had no choice but to comply. Special operations teams were sent to search the delegation's quarters. They went through every room and every piece of equipment looking for anything suspicious. The search took 18 hours and they found nothing at first. The Valkyrie representatives seemed confident that the humans would find no evidence of wrongdoing. They demanded to be released and threatened to file formal complaints with the Galactic Council, but the search teams kept looking. They brought in scientists who specialized in biological threats. They scanned every surface and tested every object. Finally, they found what they were looking for hidden inside a ceremonial statue. The statue had been scheduled to be presented to the human president at a gala event planned for the following week. It was a beautiful piece of art carved from a material that looked like crystal, but inside its hollow center was a sophisticated device. The device was designed to slowly release a microscopic pathogen into the air once the statue was placed in a public location. The pathogen itself was incredibly complex. Human scientists analyzed it and found that it was specifically engineered to attack human biology. It targeted the respiratory system first and then spread to other organs. The mortality rate would have been close to 90%. Billions of people would have died within months of exposure. The discovery created an immediate crisis. Earth Command contacted the Valkyrie government directly and presented the evidence. They showed them the weapon and the analysis of the pathogen. They demanded an explanation. The Valkyrie government denied everything. They claimed the device must have been planted by someone trying to sabotage relations between their species. They insisted they were a peaceful civilization that would never engage in biological warfare. But humanity was not convinced by these denials. They started sharing their findings with other alien species in the local sector. They sent out the medical evidence from Lyra's blood work showing immunity to dozens of engineered diseases. They provided historical data that Lyra had given them about past Valkyrie conquests. They asked other species to review their own histories and look for patterns. The response was shocking. One species after another came forward with similar stories. They described mysterious plagues that had devastated their populations decades or centuries ago. They talked about the Valkyrie arriving with cures and demanding submission in return. Some species had been living under Valkyrie control for so long, they had almost forgotten they were once free. The pattern was undeniable once people started looking for it. A coalition began to form among the species that had suffered under Valkyrie domination. Humanity took a leading role in organizing this alliance because they had avoided the trap. They had proof of Valkyrie methods and they had Lyra who could explain how everything worked. The coalition demanded that the Valkyrie government answer for their crimes. They called for sanctions and restrictions on Valkyrie movement through space. The Valkyrie responded by withdrawing behind their borders. They recalled all their diplomatic missions and cut off contact with other species. Their government issued a statement saying they were the victims of a conspiracy designed to destroy their reputation. They claimed they would defend themselves against any aggression, but their retreat told a different story. They knew they had been exposed and they had no good defense. Lyra testified before the Human Colonial Council about everything she knew. The session was broadcast across human space and millions of people watched. She stood in front of the council members and explained in careful detail how her people had built an empire on genocide. She described the biological weapons program and the systematic extermination of other species. She answered questions for hours without hesitation. It was painful for her to speak against her own people. Jake could see the sadness in her eyes every time she had to describe another atrocity, but she never wavered. She had seen too much suffering to remain silent. She told the council that she hoped humanity would be better than the Velkari. She hoped they would use their knowledge to protect others rather than to conquer them. The council granted Lyra asylum on Earth. They declared her a friend of humanity and promised she would always have a home among humans. They also announced that she would be given citizenship and full legal protection. Several council members personally thanked her for her courage. They said she had saved billions of lives by coming forward with the truth. The media attention after the testimony was overwhelming. Lyra's face was on every news channel. People wanted to know everything about the alien girl who had exposed the Velkari plot. Some called her a hero, while others debated whether she could be trusted. Jake stayed close to her during this time, making sure she was safe and helping her deal with the pressure. After a few weeks, the attention started to die down. Lyra was free to make her own choices about what to do next. She could have gone anywhere or done anything, but she chose to stay on New Haven with Jake. She said she felt safe there and she wanted to learn more about humanity. She enrolled in the Colonial University to study medicine and biology. She wanted to use her knowledge of Velkari science to help people rather than harm them. Jake returned to his cargo runs, but things were different now. Lyra often traveled with him when she had breaks from school. She served as an informal ambassador, helping to ease tensions with other alien species. Her presence on human ships was seen as a symbol of cooperation and trust. Other species knew her story and they respected her for standing up against her own people. 2 years passed and life settled into a comfortable routine. Jake and Lyra lived in a larger apartment now in a better part of the city. She had graduated top of her class in xenobiology and was working at a research center studying alien diseases. Her goal was to develop better treatments for species that had been affected by biological weapons. She wanted to undo some of the damage her people had caused. One evening they sat together on the balcony of their apartment watching the sunset over New Haven. The sky was turning brilliant shades of orange and purple. Lyra turned to Jake and thanked him again for giving her food that day in his cargo hold. She said it was strange how such a small act of kindness had changed everything. Jake smiled and told her it was not just the food. It was the choice to see her as a person rather than a threat. It was the decision to listen instead of judging. It was the willingness to risk his own safety to help a stranger. Those were the things that really mattered. He said humans were not perfect, but most of them tried to do the right thing when it counted. Lyra laughed and said she had learned that humans could be stubborn and difficult and sometimes foolish. But they also had a capacity for compassion that she had never seen in her own people. They helped each other even when it cost them something. They stood up for what was right even when it was dangerous. Those qualities made them special. The Velkari Empire was slowly crumbling as species gained their freedom. The coalition that humanity had helped form was growing stronger. Former slave species were reclaiming their independence and rebuilding their civilizations. It would take generations to undo all the damage the Velkari had caused, but at least now there was hope. The story of Jake and Lyra became famous across human space. It was taught in schools as an example of why kindness mattered. Children learned about the cargo pilot who gave food to a starving alien, and the girl who saved billions by telling the truth. The story reminded people that small choices could have enormous consequences. A single act of compassion had stopped a genocide. Jake never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a guy who flew cargo ships and tried to do the right thing. But Lyra knew better. She understood that heroes were not always the people who fought battles or made grand speeches. Sometimes heroes were ordinary people who made simple choices. They fed the hungry and protected the weak and stood up when others looked away. Those were the people who really changed the world. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake and Lyra sat together in comfortable silence. They had been through so much together, and their bond had become something like family. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, and somewhere in the galaxy other species were living free because a human had chosen kindness over fear.